Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 29. I am the show's host, Kyle, and I'd just like to thank all my listeners. Again, you guys are doing an awesome job of sharing the show and getting it out there to new people. I do what I can to share the show with new people, but just the way social media works and kind of how shows get out there, the more people you have recommending it, the better it does. And From what I could see and what I notice happening, it does look like a lot of my listeners are sharing the show. So if you guys could keep doing that, thank you so much. It's going to help the show to grow. And this is such an important issue, and it's so undercovered in the mainstream media, and it's so underappreciated by the American people that if we can get this show out there, we can get people to realize the true consequences, not only for the people in the countries that America is at war with, but also the consequences for Americans at home. There's so many of really important things that happen during wartime that you can't underestimate the importance of the issue. Not only are aggressive wars obviously immoral, we have situations like, I think one of the better examples, Syria, Libya, or Yemen, three countries where especially Syria. We don't even have a lot of attackers coming out of Syria to the United States. We haven't had years and years of war. There was no Gulf War I that preceded the Iraq War or anything like that coming from Syria. And so we're just have an aggressive war against Syria, and we have situations where the U.S. kills 30 people here, innocent civilians, women, children, people who never lifted a finger against the United States of America, people who maybe even oppose America's enemies and ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and Al-Sham in Syria, but at the same time, they're just victims of U.S. bombs, and they're at some point we have to raise the question, is what we're doing wrong? Is it wrong to drop bombs on Syria? And at what point is it time for us to just stop? I think, even if you're dropping bombs with, quote unquote good intentions, I think whenever you start killing innocent civilians, then you really have to consider, am I on the wrong side now? Maybe it was one thing for the U.S. to drop a bomb or two on Al-Qaeda members post 9/11, assuming that there wouldn't be any civilian casualties, but whenever you're conducting such an extensive air war in Syria that you're accidentally bombing mosques and just with innocent worshippers inside, you really have to realize that what you're doing there is immoral. And that's like kind of the thing abroad, is that we're killing innocent civilians who never did anything to America, and this is definitely something that we should all see as immoral. But just looking at the consequences, the practical consequences of what happens at home when we have these wars abroad, you certainly look and see what happened under the Iraq and Afghanistan wars when we developed Homeland Security, it now requires a near full body search just to board an airplane in America. Anybody who is boarding an airplane in America is subject to that kind of search. Unless, of course, I guess if you're a very elite person and have, maybe a private jet or something like that, then you probably get to bypass some of the security. But it does create a kind of a to America scenario where there are those people who have the ability to board an airplane, their own private airplane, take off from wherever they want, and travel around the country unmolested by the TSA. And then you have the rest of us who don't have that luxury. And if a father is taking his family on a vacation, his little girl, his son, is subject to be molested by the TSA, and that's just something as Americans we have to deal with because of our foreign policy. Another consequence that people don't realize but is absolutely there is the consequence to our veterans. Many have PTSD, come back with missing limbs, burns. You have traumatic brain injuries. I was listening to an interview not that long ago with a veteran saying that all like kind of the concussion blast, not even directly from combat, but also from, doing drills and practice raids, all that has caused him to have some neurological disorder that's requiring treatment for the rest of his life now. And I think, even regardless of the PTSD issue, you have veterans who just really struggle with the morality of what they did, especially whenever there are wars like you have in Afghanistan, Iraq, and all the wars we're fighting now, where while we may be fighting people that we consider to be bad people, and consider, we're targeting the bad guys and Bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. We are killing a lot of civilians at the same time, and you're occupying countries, and you're kicking down the doors of innocent civilians in their homes at night. And I'm sure, having to cope with the morality of what you're doing there cannot be easy. And so among veterans, you have a lot of people who just struggle to transition back into normal life once they return home. A lot of times, overseas, your adrenaline is always turned up, and you come back home and now you're sitting behind a desk all day. Well, how can you make that transition? How can you feel like your life is meaningful when it goes from 24/7 action hero to, you're reading memos all day and stamping paper? That can't be an easy transition at all. You have just the rampant homelessness and addiction issues because the VA is essentially socialized medicine and can provide efficient or effective treatment to our veterans. Our veterans have to seek other outlets to deal with their numerous problems, not just like the PTSD and other mental issues, but maybe physical pain or being disfigured in some sort of way, losing limbs and stuff like that. They have to resort to some kind of drug to help them, and since the VA is unable to provide more, certainly better medical treatment, and certainly, that long term, while heroin or a game drum may get you through the night, is certainly not a long-term solution to your PTSD. And so if the VA was able to provide better for these people, which it will never be able to, a government bureaucracy will never be able to provide to veterans, you're just gonna have this. And so this is another consequence of war, is that you will have people who signed up to go fight overseas believing that they were doing it for the betterment of all of us, and who will spend the rest of their lives addicted, homeless, and possibly committing suicide. We have so many veterans that just can't handle it and end up shooting themselves. I mean, as inefficient, as terrible as the VA is, I think you have another problem with the VA is just so heavily bureaucratic because it's a government institution. And I think a lot of the kids who end up joining the military maybe do it because, they're much more physically oriented people over paperwork oriented. Thinking of some of the young men that I know who have joined the Army, I'm sure part of the reason they did it is because, they're incapable of sitting behind a desk and filling out paperwork, and they're not going to read the small print. And so once they get out and they're now forced to try to kind of navigate the bureaucracy of the VA to get the treatment that they need so badly, they just don't have the patience or the talent to do it. It isn't difficult. It isn't easy, is what I'm saying, to navigate through the government bureaucracy, and it takes a lot of time and patience and attention to detail, and some people don't have those skills, and I'm guessing that a lot of young men who join the military simply don't, and when they get out, they're now looking for help and treatment, and they don't have the skills to navigate the bureaucracy, and so they end up suffering with pain for the rest of their lives, and maybe rather than getting the treatment they need because they can't handle the stress or just the complications of the bureaucracy, they end up resorting to the easier method, which is you drive down to the local quote-unquote pharmacy and you pick up, whatever drug will get you through the night, whether it's, weed, coke, heroin, meth, what have you. This is kind of the solution that people end up seeking. And so, again, this is a consequence of war that most Americans don't realize and don't plan on having to deal with. But this is absolutely one of the things we have to deal with. Another one is the hatred and the moral corruption that will build up in the society at home. I don't know exactly how many Americans have served overseas since the War on Terror started in 2001, but I'm assuming that there's probably been like 1 million tours of duty or so. And some people serving multiple times, maybe 250,000 to 500,000 troops have served overseas in combat zones since the start of this war. A few thousand have ended up dead. Tens of thousands have ended up dead from either addiction issues, physical issues that, they didn't die during war, but whenever you maybe survive an IED blast, it certainly shortens your expected lifespan, or if you have a traumatic brain injury, eventually it's gonna kill you, addiction issues, suicide, all these things. And so then, you probably put the number of soldiers who died directly from their combat experience, into the high tens of thousands of young men who have died, and women, of course. When you just look at the critical amount of time that mothers and fathers had to spend away from their children, especially at critical times in the child's life, many of the people, serving in the military are between 18 and 30 years old, and that's the time of life where, you have children. And so if you're a mother or a father who decides to have a children during that time, you could spend the first you could spend a year or two of your child's first 10 years in life in a foreign country overseas. I'm sure that's traumatic on the child. For the loved ones, the parents, the family members, the friends of the soldiers that are serving overseas, it can't be easy to, have these constant worries that somebody's gonna get killed by a suicide bomber or shot, or an IED is gonna explode and kill them, and so this is certainly gonna build resentment between one culture and another. And I've certainly detailed this in past podcasts, but I think it's just important to remember again that this is a consequence of war. When the left is so terrified of Islamophobia among American people, they never turn their attention and say, oh, look, we have this giant elephant in the room, which is a 16-year war against the Muslim world. Should we be concerned about this? Should we think this is maybe having some part in the hatred that Americans are starting to have for Muslim people? But I think largely due to partisan politics, nobody wants to talk about this issue. The right obviously doesn't want to talk about this issue because they're big into the militarization and like a strong national defense and all of that. And any talk you have that's not in direct support of more and new military action is seen as anti-American. And on the left, you have the situation where Barack Obama was just as bad as George Bush on the terror war. I know a lot of people try to, split hairs and say, well, Obama did this and Bush did this. At the end of the day, they both bombed countries for their pretty much entire term in office. And those countries were extensively Muslim countries. And this is the importance of this podcast. This is important. The importance of the foreign policy issue in general is that there are these consequences and so many more of our foreign policy that nobody realizes. I mean, look at the debt. Here's another gigantic consequence of the war. We've spent trillions and trillions of dollars on the war on terror since the start of 2001. I don't know exactly how many trillions it is. We're on the hook. Or even if we bring all of our troops home today, we're still on the hook for trillions more in contracts we already have signed, and just veterans needing care for the rest of their lives and stuff like that. And so these are all parts of war. This is all part of wanting to have this foreign policy overseas. And I think so many Americans try to ignore the foreign policy issue because there's so much else. I mean, we're talking about who uses what bathroom, and the tax code and the tax burden and immigration and Obamacare and all kinds of other issues that all seem to be more direct to most Americans. However, when you really examine the consequences of our foreign policy, I think it's pretty clear, pretty like night and day difference that it certainly has more of an impact on the lives of more Americans than they ever realize, and how important this issue is, and that we realize and look at this and make our leaders answer for what's going on in the foreign policy realm is really important. All right, so with that little rant to start the show, I will now get into the news. We have Lockheed Martin getting another extra $4 billion for the helicopter program that I mentioned in a previous episode. The Pentagon granted Lockheed Martin a $27 billion contract originally to design and then produce, I believe, 200 new helicopters. The cost of that program is already up to $31 billion. And so, talking about what I was talking about before, and the consequence that war costs a lot of money. Here's another gigantic cost. The U.S. taxpayers were already $20 trillion in debt. Here's another $31 billion. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are all underfunded and are eventually going to collapse. And yet we're spending $31 billion to build a new helicopter. And I mean, as Americans, do we need a new helicopter? Is the Black Hawk not sufficient? I mean, we just spent $1 trillion on the F-30 or F-31, 35, I believe. And, with that new plane that's able to provide like close ground to air to ground support, do we need a new helicopter? I mean, these questions are never examined, and this is never debated among the American people, but it has such huge and enormous economic consequences. In Turkey, we have Erdogan receiving a 90-day expansion of emergency powers. These powers were originally granted to Erdogan after the coup attempt in July. I really touched on the Turkey thing last time, so I don't want to get too much into it, but this is just definitely a cause for concern. Erdogan is not somebody that I necessarily trust to have a lot of power. He's seems to be a little bit of a madman to me. Definitely has dictatorial ambitions, wants to completely rule the Turkish Empire and maybe expand the Turkish Empire. So this is definitely something that we need to keep our eye on, be concerned about. What kind of powers is he getting? Is he going to get the power to just unilaterally start war? And is that something that we want an ally to be able to do? I mean, Turkey is a NATO ally to the U.S., meaning that if Turkey is attacked, the U.S. is bound to go to war to defend Turkey. And if you have Turkey acting belligerently, does America need to re-examine Turkey's involvement in the NATO alliance? Do we need to examine our own involvement in the NATO alliance? I think this is definitely something, as Americans, we all need to be aware of. If we start sending millions of Americans to Turkey to go fight and die for the sovereignty of Turkey, I think this is a debate we should be having now as well as when that occurs. We also have the EU calling for an investigation into the Turkey referendum vote. There was a lot of allegations of voter fraud following the vote. The vote was pretty close, 51-49. I think, the split was pretty small. There was a lot of ballots that apparently came in and that weren't officially stamped. Of course, the Turkish government claims, this was just a silly mistake. Some of the people forgot they had to stamp their ballots, but we're going to go ahead and count them anyways because every vote counts. The Turkish court said, absolutely, this is how things are going to work. So I don't think anything is going to change. I don't think we're going to get the Turkish government to do a recount and then suddenly Erdogan is no longer winning the referendum and loses all of his power. I think it's much more likely that these calls are either ignored or uses Erdogan to distance himself from Europe. While Turkey is not an EU member, I believe Turkey has been waiting on EU membership and has kind of wanted to get into that club in the past, but I think Erdogan will probably move away from that, especially with these calls of the EU to investigate. Another thing I just think is kind of funny about this is that if a Middle Eastern country like Turkey or Saudi Arabia condemned any EU type of election for seeming illegitimate or called into question, let's say the Democratic primary between Sanders and Clinton, the Western country would be absolutely outraged that any of these countries had any say in their election process over their election process whatsoever. And it just seems kind of judgmental and silly that the EU is making this condemnation. I also like to touch on the stories coming out of North Korea with the aircraft carriers. There seems to be some discrepancy between what I had originally said and what was being reported and the reality here. It looks like that at least some of the aircraft carriers that were supposed to be headed directly for the water surrounding North Korea or at least taking a detour, if not going to North Korea at all. I don't know if this was a kind of a stunt on the part of Trump to maybe try to scare North Korea a little bit by saying they're all coming here, or if maybe the media just really didn't understand the logistics of how long it takes to get an aircraft carrier somewhere, and especially maybe they were scheduled for stops and stuff. I think the Carl Vision was one of the aircraft carriers that was supposed to be in the waters outside of North Korea and made a stop to do some war games in Australia, is now floating somewhere around the Indonesian islands, I think moving towards North Korea now. So this is just interesting. Keep our eyes on it. I want to talk about Yemen for just a minute. First of all, don't forget Yemen. This is, I think, probably the next war the U.S. is going to escalate in, either Yemen or Somalia, one of the sides of the Red Sea there. We have 60% of Yemeni people starving, 19 million of the 26 million people who live in the country in need of humanitarian assistance. So the situation for the people of Yemen and in Yemen is just not good. We're going to be looking at mass starvation pretty shortly, and something definitely needs to be done about it. The best move for the West, like the UK and the US, is to simply stop supporting Saudi Arabia and let Saudi Arabia kind of withdraw and back down from this conflict. The big event upcoming will be the port of Hodeidah. which is currently controlled by the Houthis, and the Saudi Arabia bad forces are looking at taking that port. If that port is taken and if the port's destroyed, then I think it's going to mean a lot of starvation for the people in the north of Yemen, and it's not good. And while I certainly don't think that the Houthis who control the northern area are probably good people, they're probably taking some of the food or rations for their own fighters and not the civilian population. However, at least there's not that many people in Yemen starving right now. But if this war is closed, there's going to be a hell of a lot more. And, the U.S. really needs to figure out what they're going to do. And if they are going to support Saudi Arabia, if they're going to support the starving of Yemen, if the United States citizens want to have the blood of Yemenis on their hand, this is a debate that we need to have. And that so many in Congress, in the White House, and people in the American public are just not willing to look at this issue at all. I think because the morality is so obviously bad for Americans, that it's so obvious that America is in the wrong here. Americans just want to kind of ignore the issue. I think the members of Congress are really trying to avoid getting involved. Although we did have 50 Cent Trump a letter saying that if he wants to escalate in Yemen, he will need approval from Congress, although I don't know what kind of power that letter carries, so that's definitely something just to note. I mean, the people of Yemen are going to starve, and as Americans, do we want to let our government support the starving of millions of people, including a lot of little babies? If Trump really cares about children, please care about humane children too. We also have a Saudi Black Hawk helicopter crashing in Yemen, killing 12 Saudi officers. I don't think Saudi has much of a military to begin with, so it's interesting that they're carrying on this war in Yemen so long. It obviously hasn't gone how they planned, so maybe events like this will help Saudi Arabia to realize how stupid this is and withdraw. We have 300 Marines moving into the Helmand province of Afghanistan towards the end of the month. I need to do a little bit more research to find out if this is 300 additional Marines moving to Helmand. I had heard under Obama that 200 were going to Helmand. It just takes a while for things to move in the military, maybe, and these are the same people. These are the same Marines that we are talking about moving in before. The Helmand province is significant just because so many Marines have died there in the past, and is again an example of the futility of America's war in Afghanistan. As hard as we try to secure this very important province in Afghanistan, the Taliban always come back when the Americans leave. In Mosul, we have reports that people are starving to death in the old city, kind of waiting to be liberated as the Iraqi military moves very, very slowly taking out ISIS. I guess ISIS is kind of door to door at this point. They're kicking down doors, they're clearing houses of ISIS and moving on. I suppose ISIS is using a lot of motorcycle suicide bombers to attack the Iraqi army, and so it's really just a mess. But people in Mosul are surviving on flour boiled in wheat grain water. I have no idea how terrible that would be to eat, and I'm sure the people there absolutely hate it, but there's really nowhere to flee. It's a complete disaster, and this is just another crisis that was brought on by American interventionism. To wrap up the show, I just want to touch on Syria. We have a lot of civilians being killed in Syria. We first had the U.S. Conducting a strike against an ISIS target in the Deir Zor province of Syria and killing between 13 and 20 civilians along with possibly 3 ISIS fighters. We had America killing 30 civilians, mostly women and children, near the Syria border with Iraq. We have 14 civilians killed by Russian and Syrian bombers. And so this is the consequences of war, is that a lot of innocent children are going to die. Imagine if 30 people died in America from any single incident, whether it is a bombing or a terrorist attack, a shooting. There would be calls for reform. There would be major protests. Anytime 30 people die in a shooting, we have major protests. If it was a bombing, we would look for legislation surrounding that. We have investigations that would run on the news 24/7. In Syria, it's just a daily event. And so, wow. I mean, this is just a mess. We also have the report coming out about the bombing of the mosque near Aleppo. I believe the U.S. bombed this mosque, killed 30-something civilians who were praying. The U.S. initially claimed, no, we didn't bomb a mosque, we bombed an Al-Qaeda hangout. Turns out that the mosque had the new mosque had been built, and that's what the U.S. bombed. The U.S. didn't realize this, and again, just another consequence of war. This is a war crime, and obviously somebody within the U.S. military, if not Donald Trump himself, should face the charges of murder for all these people. So, yeah, that's where we stand in Syria. We kill people with impunity. Alright, that'll wrap up my show for today. If you like the show, you're enjoying the show, please share the show with your friends, family, whoever you think could pay attention to something like this. It's extremely important, like I detailed in the first half of the show. Check out my personal website, kylesfilesblog.com, files spelled F-Y-L-E-S. I also have a Facebook page, Kyle's Files, where I post all my content, my news roundups, and my podcast, and the other podcasts I do. You check out the page for the podcast at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. You can check out my Twitter at KYAAALE. And as always, 5-star rating and review on iTunes. Subscribe to the show. That way you never miss an episode. Thanks, everybody.